light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. In doing these shows, which, goodness, at this point we're over 260 shows, people occasionally ask how I manage to find enough experts and on whatever subject to be guests on the show. And I have had many knowledgeable and wonderful people, but I kind of shy away from the word expert because ultimately I think we can be experts with regard to our own experience, but because there is always more to learn about every single subject, with each of these shows, with any subject we discuss, there is no final word. There is only this part of the conversation, this part of the dialogue. And if anyone has anything to add, they're of course always welcome to contact me to be a guest on the show and add part of the conversation that maybe we overlooked. Ultimately, what we're about is a quest for truth, but not truth in the simplistic sense, truth in the multidimensional universal sense that everywhere you look there is a different sparkle and a different facet and a different aspect of truth. And in some ways it's all part of the same truth, and yet like the facets of a diamond, they're all facets of the same diamond, but each facet is unique. Each facet is not synonymous with any other facet, but all of the facets together combine to form the beauty of the diamond, or of any polished stone that is faceted. I frequently lament that I'm probably not the most qualified person to be doing what I'm doing, but I wind up doing a lot of things simply because I don't see anyone else doing it. And I don't like that some things are not discussed simply because the person who is most knowledgeable, or as far as we know most knowledgeable, isn't addressing the subject openly. Some people even want there to be indoctrination rather than dialogue, as if the answers from one time and place put forth by one particular person could in fact be effective in every time, in every place, in every situation. I would suggest that there is no answer that is that universally applicable. That in every case, even when we have a general principle that is broadly applicable, to give it specific form within a situation is a very individual sort of thing. And the form even the same person would give in this moment is not the same form they would give in the next moment after it, or 2 weeks from now, or 2 months from now. But that everything has to remain so interlocked with its context. I have various New Age religion-oriented friends who speak of reality as an illusion, and that never quite sat right with me because I saw some of them using that as an excuse to avoid dealing with whatever their reality included, as if having an elephant in the living room and the elephant is making a mess, and instead of cleaning up the mess from the elephant, they simply sit there in their chair insisting it's all an illusion anyway. And so they don't clean up the mess and they wound up drowning in the mess, basically. Some of the things I say may actually be relatively reasonably intelligent. I hope so. Some of the things I say are foolish and well-intended, but thoroughly misguided. In everything, I encourage people to hold on to whatever is helpful and to let the rest go. It amazes me somewhat over time, though, when people come up to me and they comment on particular shows of episodes of this ongoing television series that they've seen, and tell me what was most meaningful to them. And it is often the moment at which I felt most awkward and ill at ease and stumbling over my words and inept. And yet somehow, that's where I finally came to the conclusion that I need to show up and do my best, and I need to trust the work and not censor it, not hold it back and refuse to distribute it or cable cast it or share it with people simply because I didn't think it was perfect enough. But instead to trust the work in its own unique, perhaps wacky way to do whatever good it can do. And so I record these shows and I put them out there and let them go, and sometimes God actually uses them. I don't particularly know why God chooses to use them, because I don't consider them very perfect, as I've already said, but as long as God continues to use them, I feel like I'm supposed to continue making them. And so if demonstrating a bit of honesty and being open about these sorts of things is genuinely helpful to people, well then I will continue doing it. And it, on one hand, it's encouraging when I do get that sort of response from members of the viewing audience. The one young lady who came up to me and said she'd been watching me on television all of her life, and considering that the first show was cable cast in November of 1992, since she was she looked to be in her late teens perhaps, at the time she told me this, and I counted the years quickly in my head and said, well, it's entirely possible that she had been watching me on television all of her life, and I hope that my influence or effect or contribution to her development was specifically a positive one. Another person came up to me once and said, I've seen your show and it's disturbing. Thank you. And I said, you're quite welcome. If there's anything else you'd like me to address on the show, or if you want to be a guest, just let me know. I'd be glad to have you on the show. I'm not trying to reassure people by this show. I'm not trying to send everyone out grinning like Pollyanna. I do hope, though, none of us, in watching any half-hour show, not even I am going to remember every single word that was said in that show. But I hope for each person watching the show that there is something, one little piece that is specifically helpful to them that they can find somewhere within the spectrum of stuff the show contains. And to consider in that we shouldn't run away from our vulnerability and our honesty, because these are often the things that speak most deeply and truly and eloquently to those about whom we care the most. I think as much as the advertising world would have us believe that perfection is the goal, most people don't really want perfection. I would suggest, it seems to me, that what people want is honesty and truth and love. And genuine, truthful love is getting so hard to find that it becomes all the more precious when you do find it, and it's totally forgivable if the person isn't perfectly eloquent, and if they stumble over their words, if they occasionally even say the completely wrong thing and have to beg for forgiveness. Even that can be an example of how graciousness can be demonstrated under duress, and how imperfection need not ever be something that absolutely defeats us. Making a mistake can be an event, or it can be a point of stagnation. There are people who make mistakes and dwell on that mistake so long that it's as if they never move beyond it. People do make mistakes. Should they be overlooked and ignored? No. Should they be the cage in which you dwell for the rest of your life? Absolutely not. Somewhere in between, though, is this gray area of happenings and of life becoming ever more than it has been. And in not running from my imperfections, in not trying to hide the fact that I'm imperfect, in not trying to hide the fact that I love to sing, I write songs, but no, I am not any Whitney Houston. I am not a Barbra Streisand. I don't have the singing ability to wow large audiences and make millions of dollars from it. But I guess my idealized, perhaps romanticized conception of tribal society includes that everyone danced and everyone sang, and it wasn't about who sang well, who had the most beautiful voice, who had a bad voice, who danced well. It was about participation. The value of it was not in the skill, but in the participation. The not effectiveness, but the presentation of it can always be rehearsed and polished in all sorts of ways. It doesn't mean we're supposed to give up aspirations. But ultimately what matters more than whether we gave up or whether we didn't give up is whether we in fact started. Because if you don't start, there won't even be the choice of whether or not to give up when things get difficult. So I persist. And when a subject really needs to be discussed and I don't have any expert, I show up here and let you listen, and I try to, well, as they said in my graduate school context environment, we deconstruct it. We take a thing and figure out what all its constitutive pieces and parts are. You know, that you can have trust only if you have accountability. When you have accountability, you can then have trust. The two function as interlocking pieces. There are ways that my inept little humble contribution manages to touch people's hearts. And yet even that's a bit of a misnomer, because I've heard people say, I was really touched by that song, or somebody plays a beautiful song and people are so happy and so inspired they have tears running down their cheeks. Well, and that's quite a high compliment when that happens. But there's even more beyond that. That in being blessed by that from someone else, the invitation is to go home, look in the mirror, and find out what contribution each of us could make that we may not be making yet. You know, that it's not just about someone blessing us, but it's about us continuing to pass that blessing along. That, like the law of physics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it simply changes form. We've got to keep this energy flowing. And when we receive the energy of inspiration because someone didn't listen when they were told they couldn't sing, and they didn't listen when they were told they couldn't dance, and instead they came out and they sang and they danced, and we got inspired and went home to have more love in our relationships, have more truth in our life, have more honesty in our conversation. And if someone were to say, why have these things happened in your life, and you named your point of inspiration, they might look at you funny and say, that's the person who inspired you? I can think of lots of people way more inspiring than him or her or whoever it is. To which you would simply have to say, well, I'm sure that other people might have been more inspiring, but this is the person who was inspiring. The difficult part in that, I guess, is being that other person who doesn't know that they've been inspiring. That who has given of himself or herself and really poured themselves into the situation, done all the good they can, and somehow in the end it just doesn't seem to be noticed, and they kind of fade out of the picture, not realizing this other conversation has just happened in which they were given credit for having affected so many people's lives. That's where we come back to kind of being a community for each other. That if we include the foolish, the angry, the exaggerated, the extreme, the neutral, the dull, include all those people in our sense of community. And having included them in our sense of community, to find that there are all these additional things that become part of who we collectively are. As much as there is an individual identity, there is also a collective identity. But if you pursue the collective identity, to my observation, you generally lose track of the individual identity. And to the extent that you pursue the individual identity, you generally lose track of the communal identity. Ultimately, the two are intended to be symbiotic, to be two things that each is feeding the other, each is keeping the other going, keeping the other alive. It's easy to forget from day to day, however, just how interconnected we are and just how interdependent we are. There is a sense, however, in which the compliment we extend to others may be the compliment that gets them over the hump to where they finally decide to give love and give life a chance and find, discover that sense of self that their old ways of being couldn't have supported or kept or fed. That, how do we put this? When we dare to put our foolishness and our vulnerability out where it can be scrutinized, we risk the chance that others will be harsh and judgmental and unforgiving and exclusionary. But like Pandora's box, when we put that out there, we also release hope into the world, and we give people a chance to open a new door and a new world of possibilities, a new way of being who we are, and a new way of contributing to our communities. As Sister Who, my whole purpose, I keep telling people over and over and over again, is to serve the personal and spiritual growth of others. As Sister Who, I consider myself to be a more basic level of personhood, the question of being a who before you can be a he or she, and being a he or she before you can be gay or straight. To understand that a person is a person is a person is a person. And upon that principle, to say that even when I am a foolish person whose voice is not all that perfect, whose language is not always expressed with perfect eloquence, that even with all those things, there is something in what I offer and something in what I bring that God can use and that makes a difference in somebody's life. And that, to me, is the supreme honor, to be part of the spiritual and personal growth of someone else. And yet, God and I are forever having arguments about what a poor choice that can sometimes be. That there are so many people who could do this work so much better, and so many people who are so much better funded than I am to do the work at all. And yet, so I'm doing this very limited sort of setup with whatever's available, hoping it's good enough to touch someone's heart, hoping it's good enough to make a difference, because in making a difference in someone else's life, we create something that will outlive us, and we give to something that is bigger than ourselves. I've had various people suggest that the time for Sister Who's peculiar ministry is gone, and that really I should just be content with doing comedic, lighthearted stuff and just entertaining people. And yet I've never found that that's where my calling is. Somewhere deep inside of me is still this yearning to use the symbols and use the metaphors and expound upon whatever truths I discover in ways that will help other people, I hope, discover their lives and the capacities of their lives, the capabilities that they didn't realize they had. and the miracles that can happen when we have the nerve to stand up and be truthful with those around us, to say, this is who I am, and I want to support who you are too. It's not an either or, it's a both and. It's not having to choose between black and white, but it's finding a way to build a checkerboard, one might say. Finding a way to integrate all the valuable and wonderful pieces and idiosyncrasies. Finding a way of including everyone, of absolutely everyone. Instead of saying you're not what we had in mind, to say, well, you're not what we had in mind, but I think we could use you right over here. I don't know whether I matter or not sometimes. I don't know whether I could be useful to anyone or no one. And yet, I continue to have this creative compulsion and this wanting to talk about deep and complex ideas and figure out, if all of this is true, what must also be true? And if this work has built to being this many TV shows, and if that many people are watching, is that success? Well, not necessarily either, because ultimately success can only be measured by God, because the only thing that is the true measure of success for Sisterhood is whether in fact people have grown spiritually and emotionally beyond wherever they are, whatever they've known thus far. For people to relinquish their death grip, as they say, upon doctrine and dogma, and to understand that all of the universe is one big open door of possibility. And because the divine will be with us every step of the way, we can learn what we need to learn in every situation. And there really ultimately isn't anything to be afraid of. Yes, we have vulnerability, but the interesting thing about vulnerability, in some cases, not every case, but in some cases, when we dare to put our vulnerability out there, it's the paradox, I suppose, of showing the greatest courage and the greatest strength by being willing to expose and present to others the greatest vulnerability and the greatest limitation. But we have to love each person we encounter along the way. And sometimes that can be intensely difficult, especially when they're a sadly broken person who may have even reached out and tried or succeeded in hurting us as well. Forgive and forget. Well, forgiveness is a nice word, a nice thought, but ultimately you have to put some substance underneath that forgiveness by coming to some point of understanding the other person's humanness or humanity. That when we embrace our vulnerability and our humanity, there's a paradoxical sort of dynamic that kicks into gear that begins to bloom like a flower. That the same sort of vulnerability and honesty that makes us targets, in a sense, for malicious behavior is also the dynamic by which we open to the universe. And we're finally in a place where that which is truly God can truly speak to us. I've gone on about a lot of different things in the last half hour, and I hope that at least some of these have been helpful to you in understanding that you too don't have to wait for somebody else's approval. You don't have to be the best in the world. You simply have to be doing your best. You don't have to bring someone to a place of spiritual maturity or complete agreement. You simply need to do what you can to help them through the next step. And hopefully there will be someone similar to you then helping them with the step beyond that, and so forth. ultimately, I think our greatest resource is each other, and when we don't have the answers we would like, when we can't legitimately call ourselves experts, the one excellent thing that we can nevertheless put forth is that we are excellent at asking questions. We're excellent at investigating a matter. We're excellent at being patient for the divine to show itself when and how it will. And in all those things, we may never be the expert on anything, but we may also find that even not being the expert, we will have a magical, far-reaching effect upon the world in which we live. And I don't know what I really have to offer, I guess, other than the ability to think critically and ask lots of questions. But I do know that a lot of people have told me that there was something something in that somewhere that was actually genuinely helpful to them. So when you look in the mirror and you see something foolish and something that's so imperfect, do your best anyway, because the world is waiting for it.